You know that moment when someone pushes you just a little too far? Well, that's exactly what happened when HOA Karen bulldozed my lakeshore trees, the very ones I had planted and cared for over decades. She had no clue that I control the dam downstream, and when I finally had enough, I made a single move that left her jaw on the ground. This is the story of how justice rolled in like a flood. Let us know where you're watching from today, and if you're new here, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to join our growing community. I've always been a simple man who finds peace in the sound of water lapping against the shore. My lakefront property has been my sanctuary for nearly 30 years. It's not a fancy place, just a sturdy wooden house I built with my own hands, a big wraparound porch, and a wide stretch of grassy yard leading down to the lake. But what makes it truly special are the trees along the shoreline. I planted them decades ago when they were nothing but saplings, each one representing a small victory in my life. Now they're tall, strong, and beautiful, standing like sentinels along the water's edge. Those trees aren't just for decoration. They help prevent erosion, provide shade for fishermen who visit the lake, and create a natural barrier that keeps my property private. I've spent years nurturing them, pruning their branches, and ensuring their roots remain healthy. They mean something to me, far beyond their physical presence. They're part of my history, a living memory of the time my late wife and I spent here, watching sunsets with a glass of sweet tea in hand. Life by the lake used to be quiet and uneventful. My neighbors are mostly older folks who, like me, appreciate peace and privacy. But then came the HOA, the so-called Homeowners Association. It was supposed to maintain the community, but all I've seen is a group of people trying to control every blade of grass. And the worst of them all, Karen. Every neighborhood has one. She's the type who struts around as if she owns the entire town, always pointing out what others are doing wrong, and never lifting a finger to help. I've had my fair share of run-ins with her over the years. At first, it was just little things, letters about my mailbox not being modern enough, or complaints about my pickup truck being an eyesore. I let it slide, figuring it wasn't worth my time or energy to fight over such nonsense. But her tone got more aggressive with each passing month. She started showing up uninvited, marching across my yard like a drill sergeant, waving her clipboard around like it was a weapon. The last time she came by before the storm started, she pointed at my trees and said, "These aren't approved by the HOA. You'll need to take them down." I stared at her, stunned. Take down my trees, the ones I've raised for decades. It wasn't going to happen. I told her as calmly as I could, "Karen, those trees are on my property, and they're staying right where they are." She gave me one of her infamous fake smiles, the kind that makes your blood boil, and said, "We'll see about that." I brushed it off, thinking it was just another empty threat. After all, I'd dealt with her before, and she always backed down when I stood my ground. But something about her tone this time felt different. She'd been elected HOA president not long ago, and I guess the new title made her think she had power over everyone. She had a way of intimidating folks. Most neighbors were too tired or too polite to push back. I wasn't. For weeks after that conversation, I kept a close eye on my property. I made sure all my documents were in order, verifying that the lakefront land and the trees were entirely mine. The HOA had no authority over the shoreline, in fact. Most of their rules didn't even apply to my property because of how it was grandfathered in decades ago. Still, something told me that Karen wasn't going to give up. On one particularly calm evening, I sat on my porch watching the sunset. The lake reflected the colors of the sky: orange, purple, and gold, like a painting I could step into. It was perfect, peaceful, but even as I sat there, I felt a nagging sense of unease. Karen was planning something. I could feel it, and I knew that when she made her move, I'd have to be ready. What she didn't know, what nobody knew, was that I held the keys to something far more powerful than any HOA rulebook. I control the dam at the far end of this lake. It's a responsibility I took on years ago when the previous owner retired. Most folks don't even realize the lake level can be adjusted, but I do. I know exactly how to handle it, when to raise or lower the gates, and how the water can change everything downstream. Back then, I didn't plan to use that power for anything more than maintaining the lake's health. But after Karen bulldozed into my life and my property, I started to realize that sometimes justice requires a little creativity. I leaned back in my rocking chair, listening to the evening crickets, and made a silent promise to myself if Karen crossed the line this time, she wouldn't just get a warning. She'd learn, once and for all, that I don't take kindly to people destroying what I love. Karen wasn't just any neighbor, she was the self-appointed queen of the HOA. Before she moved in, life around the lake was calm. We all respected each other's boundaries, and everyone handled their own property. But the moment Karen arrived, she started sniffing out violations like a bloodhound. It wasn't long before she decided my place was her #1 target. I still remember the first time we met. She came marching down my driveway, clipboard tucked under her arm, wearing oversized sunglasses even though the sun was nowhere to be seen. "Hi, I'm Karen," she announced in a tone that wasn't friendly but more like a declaration. "I'm on the HOA board, and we need to talk about your property." She didn't bother with small talk or introductions, just went straight into a list of things she didn't like. My old mailbox, my weathered fence, and even my pickup truck parked in front of my own house. "Your truck doesn't meet community standards," she said with a sniff. "It looks rustic." I laughed in her face. "Rustic lady. That truck has hauled more lumber than you've ever seen. It's part of my life, and it's not going anywhere." She didn't like that answer. From that day on, I became her personal project. She sent letters about my unsightly woodpile, claimed my lawn was too wild, and even suggested I repaint my porch because the color didn't blend with the neighborhood aesthetic. It was ridiculous. The other neighbors either ignored her or reluctantly followed her demands just to avoid trouble. But me, I wasn't about to let some HOA dictator tell me how to live on the land I worked so hard to keep. Then came the trees. One crisp morning, I found her standing at the edge of my lakefront, hands on her hips, glaring at the shoreline as if the trees had personally offended her. "These trees block the view for other residents," she said, pointing like a prosecutor. "According to HOA guidelines, you'll need to remove them." I raised an eyebrow. "According to my property deed, these trees belong to me, and they're staying right where they are." She didn't like that answer either. Her face tightened, and she muttered something about community harmony before storming off. That's when I knew this wasn't over. Karen had the kind of personality that thrived on control. Telling her no only made her more determined. For the next few weeks, I noticed her snooping around my property line more often. She'd pretend to be out for a walk, but stop just long enough to take pictures of my yard. A couple of times, I even caught her talking to the contractors who worked on her house, pointing at my property as if she was hatching some grand plan. It wasn't just about the trees anymore, it was personal. She started sending me HOA notices that were so nitpicky. They bordered on harassment. One letter said my dock lights were too bright at night. Another accused me of having unapproved landscaping because I planted wildflowers along my path. I kept all the letters in a folder, partly because I knew this would escalate, and partly because I wanted evidence of just how far she was willing to go. Then I heard from one of my neighbors that Karen had been boasting at an HOA meeting about fixing the lakefront eyesore. I didn't have to ask who she meant. I knew my property was the next battleground. I just didn't expect how far she'd go to get her way. One Saturday morning, I was sitting on my porch, sipping coffee, when I heard the rumble of heavy machinery. At first, I thought one of the neighbors was having work done on their driveway. But as the sound grew louder, my gut tightened. I set down my mug and walked to the edge of my yard, and there they were. Two massive bulldozers parked on the gravel road, with Karen standing nearby, arms crossed and wearing a smug grin. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, marching over. Karen gave me a sweet but venomous smile. The HOA approved a landscaping improvement. "These trees are being removed today." I could feel the blood pounding in my ears. On whose authority I growled. "Mine," she said flatly. "We've been patient long enough." I was stunned, angry, but I also knew I needed to play this smart. As much as I wanted to stop her right then and there, I could tell that arguing wasn't going to get me anywhere. Karen had convinced herself she was untouchable, but she didn't know who she was messing with or what kind of leverage I had. I clenched my jaw and stepped back. "Fine," I said slowly. "Do what you have to do." The look of triumph on her face told me everything I needed to know. She thought she'd won, But in that moment, I decided something. If Karen wanted a war, she was going to get one. And I had something far more powerful than bulldozers. I went back to my porch, sat down in my rocking chair, and watched. If she wanted to destroy what I loved, she was going to pay for it in a way she never saw coming. That morning is burned into my memory like a scar. The rumble of the bulldozers echoed off the still surface of the lake, breaking the peace I had treasured for decades. I stood on my porch, gripping the wooden railing, watching as the machines crept closer to my shoreline. My trees, the ones I had planted with my late wife's hands, stood tall and proud, unaware that their fate rested in the hands of a woman who cared more about neighborhood aesthetics than the history written into every branch and leaf. Karen was there, of course, standing beside the machines like some kind of general ready to send her troops into battle. Her arms were crossed, her sunglasses reflecting the morning light, and that smug smile of hers, the one that said, "I've won," made my blood boil. I could see the contractors talking to her, pointing at the trees as if they were planning the attack. I walked down to the edge of my property and called out, "You're trespassing. These trees are on my land, and you have no right to touch them." Karen turned slowly, her smile never faltering. "Oh, we're well within our rights," she said. "The HOA approved this removal. We're doing this for the good of the community." I clenched my fists. The community. These trees don't bother anyone but you. Karen, you're not the community. You're just a busybody with a clipboard and an ego the size of Texas. The contractors shifted uneasily, clearly uncomfortable with the brewing confrontation. One of them, a young guy with a ball cap, looked at me and said, "Sir, we're just doing what we were hired to do. You might want to talk this out before we start." I glared at Karen. "There's nothing to talk about. You so much as touch one of these trees, and you'll regret it." Karen smirked, tilting her head. "Is that a threat?" "No," I said, my voice low and steady. "That's a promise. But here's the thing. I knew I couldn't stop the bulldozers physically. If I laid a hand on anyone, I'd be the one in handcuffs, not her." I had to think bigger, smarter, and that's when the thought came to me. She has no idea who she's dealing with. I own the dam. I control the lake. I could raise or lower the water levels with the turn of a wheel. And if she wanted to destroy my trees, well, maybe I'd let nature do a little destruction of its own. Still, I wasn't about to just stand there. "You'll be paying for every inch of damage," I told her. "You know that, right? Every single tree has value. I have the paperwork." Karen shrugged like she was brushing off a speck of dust. "The HOA will handle any complaints. We've dealt with people like you before, stubborn old men who think rules don't apply to them." That one stung, not because of her words, but because of how casually she dismissed me like I was just some obstacle to bulldoze over. My wife used to say that pride can be a dangerous thing, but in that moment, my pride was the only thing keeping me from tearing into Karen right there. I stepped aside, letting the contractors do their work. It wasn't because I was backing down, far from it. I wanted her to think she'd won. I wanted her to have that fleeting moment of victory before I turned the tables so hard she'd never see it coming. The bulldozers roared to life. The first tree came down with a sickening crack that made my chest tighten. I turned and walked back up to my porch. My fists clenched so tightly my knuckles were white. Each crash of wood hitting the ground felt like a punch to the gut. But I forced myself to watch. I wanted to remember this feeling. I wanted to channel every ounce of anger into what I was about to do next. By noon, my shoreline looked like a battlefield. Where once there had been a line of green, now there were stumps and splintered branches. Karen was beaming like she'd just won an award. "See," she called out as I stood silently on my porch. "Doesn't that look so much cleaner now? So much better for the community?" I didn't answer. I just stared at her, my jaw tight, my mind already turning gears. She thought this was over, but it wasn't even close. That evening, after the bulldozers left and the noise died down, I walked down to the lake. The water was calm, the sunset painting the surface in shades of red and gold. I stood there, looking at the dam in the distance, and I made my decision. If Karen wanted war, I'd give her a flood she'd never forget. The night after the bulldozers left, I couldn't sleep. I sat on my porch, staring at the jagged stumps along my shoreline. The wind whistled through what used to be a wall of green, and the place felt exposed raw. Every time I looked at that ruined stretch of land, I saw my late wife's face. I could almost hear her voice, soft but firm. "Don't let anyone push you around. Hank, this land is yours. Protect it." I knew she'd be disappointed if I just let Karen get away with this. But I also knew charging over to Karen's house and yelling wouldn't fix anything. That's not my style. I've learned over the years that the best revenge is calm, calculated, and undeniable. And in this case, I had the perfect advantage: the dam. Most folks around here don't even know how the dam works. It's not something I advertise, but I've been the one maintaining it for over 20 years. When the county needed someone reliable to handle water levels, they came to me. I've got the keys, the codes, and the knowledge to adjust the lake by several feet, depending on rainfall and seasonal needs. It's all legal, too, as long as I follow the guidelines for safety and downstream flow. Karen had no idea I was the man in charge of the water she loves bragging about in her backyard view. So I started thinking, if I made just a few adjustments timed with the heavy rain that was in the forecast, I could raise the lake just enough to send water creeping up into her precious garden. Her pristine flower beds, her new stone walkway, even those overpriced lawn chairs she boasts about. All of it could be underwater in a matter of days. And the best part, I wouldn't be breaking a single law. It would all look like a natural consequence of the weather. But before I made any moves, I needed to be sure. I spent the next morning down at the dam checking the gates and runoff points. The metal wheel was cold under my hands as I tested the settings. I made a few small adjustments, nothing noticeable yet, just enough to prepare the system. The lake's water level began to inch upward, slow and steady, like a sleeping giant waking up. Back home, I walked along the shoreline, running my hand over the rough bark of the remaining trees. The place felt different now, almost like it was holding its breath. But deep down, I wasn't just angry anymore, I was focused. Every step Karen took to control me only gave me more resolve to show her she wasn't untouchable. I spent that afternoon reinforcing my own property. I raised my dock, secured my firewood pile, and cleared out any low-lying debris. If water was going to rise, I wanted to make sure my place came out looking better than hers. I even called an old friend who used to work in landscaping and asked him to appraise the cost of replacing my trees. "She'll be paying for this," I told him, one way or another. Meanwhile, I kept an eye on Karen. She spent that day gloating, strutting around her yard like a peacock. I could see her from across the lake, giving tours of her improved view to a couple of her HOA buddies. They pointed at my property, shaking their heads like I was some old fool stuck in the past. I just smiled. Let them laugh now. They had no idea the storm that was coming. That evening, the weather forecast confirmed what I was counting on: heavy rainfall over the next 3 days. Perfect. I went back to the dam just before dusk and made another adjustment, just a little more this time. The gates creaked as I turned the wheel, and the sound of rushing water filled the air. It wasn't dramatic, not yet, but it was enough to start tipping the balance. As I stood there, I thought about the years I've spent living on this land, how much blood and sweat I've poured into keeping it beautiful. Karen didn't plant those trees. She didn't spend decades maintaining the shoreline. She just showed up one day with her rules and her attitude, thinking she could bulldoze over anyone who got in her way. Well, I'm not the kind of man you bulldoze without consequences. When I got back to my porch, I felt something I hadn't felt since this whole mess started calm. I sat down with a cold beer, watched the sun dip below the horizon, and listened to the frogs croaking by the water's edge. There was still anger simmering inside me, but now it was focused sharp like a blade. Karen thought she'd humiliated me, but what she didn't know was that I was just getting started. The lake was rising, slowly, silently, and soon it would carry a message she'd never forget. The next morning, I woke to the sound of rain tapping on my roof, steady and sure, like nature itself had joined my side. The lake's surface rippled under the gray sky, already looking fuller than usual. I sipped my coffee on the porch, watching the water creep a few inches closer to the shoreline. It was subtle, but I noticed it, and I knew Karen would notice soon enough. This wasn't about mindless revenge. It was about balance. She tore down what I spent decades building, without an ounce of respect or permission. Now she was going to learn that every action has consequences, some delivered by nature itself, with just a little help from me. That morning, I drove out to the dam again, my truck tires crunching over the gravel road. The rain soaked through my jacket as I made another careful adjustment to the gates. It was a small tweak, just enough to let the water rise naturally with the rainfall, but not enough to draw suspicion to anyone else. It would look like the lake was simply reacting to the weather. I've done this long enough to know the system inside and out. I could predict where the water would go, how far it would stretch, and what areas would take the brunt of the overflow. And wouldn't you know it, Karen's backyard was right in the path. On the way back, I swung by my neighbor's house, old Jim, who lives 2 lots down. He's a good man, the kind who minds his own business. I casually asked him if he'd heard about the rain forecast. "Looks like we're getting a good soaking this week," I said. He nodded, looking out at the lake. "Yeah, it's been a while since we had a real downpour. Probably time for the lake to swell up some." I smiled. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. If anyone asked later, this would all seem like Mother Nature's doing, not mine. By the afternoon, the water line had already risen enough to lap at the bottom of my dock. I adjusted my boat ropes, making sure everything was secure. Then I grabbed a pair of binoculars and looked across the lake toward Karen's property. She was out in her backyard, of course, fussing over her flower beds and that ridiculous stone path she'd been bragging about at the last HOA meeting. It was funny she didn't have the slightest clue that her precious landscaping was about to become a swamp. I spent the rest of the day preparing my property for the coming days. I moved firewood onto higher ground, rolled up my outdoor rugs, and tied down my patio chairs. Everything I did was quiet, methodical, like I was getting ready for a storm. And in a way, I was. Not just a storm of rain, but a storm of karma. That night, the rain came down harder, pounding on my roof like a drum. I walked out to the edge of my yard with a flashlight, watching the water creep higher. My shoreline was fine. I'd lived here long enough to know how to protect it. But Karen, she'd never faced this kind of problem before. She spent so much time trying to make her yard look perfect that she forgot how unpredictable nature can be. I could almost picture her face when she'd see the water swallowing up her prized tulips. The next morning, I went for a walk along the lake road. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. As I passed by Karen's property, I noticed she was already out there, standing in her yard with her hands on her hips. The water had crept up onto her perfectly manicured grass, leaving muddy streaks where it pooled. I gave her a friendly nod as I walked by. "Quite the rain we're getting," I said, my voice steady. She didn't look pleased. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "The lake hasn't risen like this in years." I shrugged. "Nature has its way of reminding us who's in charge." She glared at me like I had something to do with it, and technically, she wasn't wrong, but she had no proof. And I wasn't about to give her any reason to suspect the truth. Over the next 2 days, I made small, careful adjustments at the dam each evening. Nothing dramatic, just enough to keep the water steadily rising. By the 3rd morning, Karen's backyard was half flooded. Her stone path was under a shallow sheet of water, and her expensive lawn chairs were bobbing like corks. I watched from my porch with a calm satisfaction, sipping my coffee as she ran around frantically, trying to save her garden decorations. The best part, the HOA could do nothing about it. It wasn't against any rule for the lake level to rise during a rainstorm, and I was well within my legal rights as the dam's caretaker. Karen wanted to play hardball. She just didn't realize I owned the ball, the field, and the scoreboard. By the 4th day of rain, the lake looked like it had grown a new personality. The water was dark and restless, climbing steadily over the grass and creeping toward Karen's pristine backyard. I woke up early that morning, poured myself a steaming mug of coffee, and stepped out onto my porch just in time to see the drama unfold across the lake. Karen was already outside, pacing like a general whose troops were losing ground. Her perfectly styled hair was plastered against her face from the drizzle, and her bright pink raincoat looked more like a defeated flag than a symbol of control. Her once impeccable garden, the one she used to brag about at every HOA meeting, was now half submerged. Those fancy tulip beds she'd paid a small fortune for were drowning. their bright petals floating away like confetti from a ruined party. I couldn't help but smile. It wasn't a cruel smile, but one of satisfaction. She'd bulldozed my trees without a second thought, laughing as she destroyed decades of work. Now she was learning that when you disrespect someone's land, nature has a way of settling the score, especially when that someone happens to control the dam. As the water continued to rise, I saw her trying to salvage her backyard furniture. She waded into the ankle-deep water, struggling to drag those heavy wrought iron chairs to higher ground. I could hear her shouting, even from across the lake, "This is outrageous! Somebody needs to fix this." I chuckled to myself. I guess she thought yelling at the water would make it go back where it came from. Later that day, I walked over to the general store in town. It's a small place, but it's where everyone catches up on local gossip. Sure enough, a couple of neighbors were talking about Karen. "Did you see her backyard?" one woman whispered, leaning over the counter. "It's like a swamp out there." "Serves her right," said old Jim, who was grabbing a bag of feed. "She's been pushing everyone around for months. Maybe now she'll realize she's not in charge of Mother Nature." I didn't say much. I just smirked and paid for my supplies. But inside, I felt a small flicker of pride. Not only was Karen's little kingdom crumbling, but people were starting to see that her arrogance had a price. When I returned home, I noticed Karen standing at the edge of her yard, hands on her hips, glaring across the lake at me. I waved. She didn't wave back. Instead, she stomped inside her house, slamming the door hard enough that I could hear it echo over the water. That evening, the rainfall intensified, and I made one last careful adjustment at the dam. The water surged just enough to push things over the edge, literally. By the next morning, Karen's prized stone path was completely submerged, and her expensive garden ornaments were floating like driftwood. Her backyard looked less like a lawn and more like a shallow pond. I was sitting on my porch, sipping coffee, when she stormed over in her rain boots. Mud was splattered all the way up her legs, and her face was flushed with frustration. "Did you do this?" she demanded, pointing at the lake as if I controlled the weather. I tilted my head. "Do what?" "This," she shouted. "The water, my backyard, is destroyed. You're the one who manages the dam, aren't you? Don't pretend you don't have something to do with this." I set down my mug, stood up slowly, and looked her square in the eye. "Karen, I manage the dam to keep the lake safe. That's it. We've had 4 days of heavy rain. What did you expect? I can't control Mother Nature." Her mouth opened like she was ready to argue, but nothing came out. I think part of her realized I was right, at least legally. She couldn't prove anything. The truth was, I hadn't done anything outside my rights. The rain had simply given me the perfect cover. "Maybe next time," I added, my voice calm but firm, "you'll think twice before tearing down someone else's property without asking." She glared at me, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who wouldn't crumble under her HOA threats. That night, I walked down to the lake's edge. The water glistened under the moonlight, higher than I'd seen it in years. My dock stood strong, my boat secure, and my property untouched. Karen's backyard, on the other hand, looked like a disaster zone. For the first time in days, I felt at peace, not because I had won, but because I'd shown her that some battles can't be fought with clipboards and HOA rulebooks. Some battles are won by patience, timing, and knowing when to let nature take its course. But this wasn't over yet. I knew Karen, and she wasn't going to back down quietly. Which meant it was time to confront her head-on, with the one thing she hated most, proof that she was wrong. The HOA meetings were usually dull affairs, people arguing over fence paint colors, lawn heights, or whether someone's Christmas lights were too bright. But this one was different. Word had spread like wildfire about Karen's flooded backyard, and half the neighborhood showed up, hungry for drama. I could feel the tension in the air as I walked into the small community hall, a folder of documents tucked under my arm. Tonight wasn't about yelling or pointing fingers. Tonight was about ending this once and for all. Karen was already there, of course, sitting at the head of the table like a queen awaiting her subjects. Her hair was back in its usual stiff bun, and her lips were pressed into a tight line. When she saw me walk in, her eyes narrowed. She looked like a general who just spotted her rival walking onto the battlefield. "Mr. "Harper," she said sharply as I sat down, "I hope you're here to explain the destruction you caused." I didn't answer her immediately. Instead, I opened my folder and laid out a stack of papers on the table. "Before we get into wild accusations," I said evenly, "I'd like to discuss something a little more important: property rights and the damage your bulldozers caused to mine." A murmur rippled through the room. A couple of my neighbors leaned in, clearly eager to hear what was about to unfold. Karen tried to cut me off, but I wasn't having it. "You destroyed my shoreline trees without permission," I continued, my voice steady but firm. "Trees that I planted decades ago. I have photos, receipts, and official property surveys showing those trees were fully within my boundaries. You trespassed, Karen? And that's a serious legal matter." She crossed her arms, her jaw tightening. "The HOA approved that removal. We had the right to ensure the HOA has no jurisdiction over my lakefront," I said, cutting her off. I pulled out a copy of my property deed and slid it across the table. "My land is grandfathered outside your petty rules. And here's the kicker: while you were busy bulldozing what's mine, you forgot one important thing: I control the dam. The water you enjoy so much, the water you love to brag about in your backyard meetings, I manage it." The room went silent. Karen's face turned pale, and I could see her eyes flicker with a mix of shock and anger. I didn't stop. I wanted every person in that room to understand exactly who they were dealing with. "I've been the caretaker of that dam for over 20 years. I continued. "The county put me in charge because I know this land and this lake better than anyone. When it rains, I manage the levels to prevent flooding unless someone decides to pick a fight and destroy what I've built." Karen slammed her hand on the table. "Are you admitting you flooded my property on purpose?" I stared at her, calm and collected. "I didn't have to do a thing. Nature handled it just fine. But let's be clear, Karen, your backyard flood is nothing compared to the damage you caused me. You're liable for every single tree that was destroyed, and I'm not asking for an apology. I'm asking for payment." I pulled out a written estimate from my landscaper, outlining the cost to replace and restore my shoreline, tens of thousands of dollars. I slid it across the table, watching her face contort. "Either the HOA covers this, or I'll see you in court. And trust me, I'll win. I have evidence, witnesses, and a legal right to my property. You, on the other hand, have nothing but a bruised ego." The room erupted in whispers. A few neighbors nodded at me, clearly fed up with Karen's bullying. Old Jim spoke up from the back. "Karen, I think he's got a point. You've been overstepping your bounds for a while now. Maybe it's time you backed off." Karen's face went red as a tomato. She opened her mouth to argue but couldn't find the words. She knew she was cornered, and I wasn't finished. "One last thing," I said, leaning forward. "If the HOA tries anything like this again, I won't just bring lawyers. I'll contact the county. I'm sure they'd love to hear how their damn caretaker is being harassed by a rogue HOA president." The silence that followed was heavy. Karen looked around, expecting support, but no one said a word. Her power was crumbling right there in that room. I stood up, gathered my papers, and looked her dead in the eye. "You wanted control. Karen, you just lost it. Stay off my land. This is your last warning." Then I walked out, leaving her fuming as the rest of the HOA murmured behind me. I knew, deep down, this was the turning point. Karen had finally met someone she couldn't bully, and now it was time to finish what I started. The days following that HOA meeting felt like a weight had finally lifted off my shoulders. Karen, for the first time since she'd moved into this neighborhood, went quiet. No more surprise visits, no more smug lectures about community standards, and certainly no more bulldozers showing up on my property. It was like someone had clipped the wings of a noisy bird, and the peace I'd fought for was finally settling back over the lake. But I didn't just let it end there. I made sure everything was buttoned up legally. My lawyer drafted a formal letter to both Karen and the HOA board, holding them accountable for the destruction of my trees. The evidence was overwhelming photos of the bulldozers, receipts from my landscaper, and the official survey maps that proved every inch of that shoreline belonged to me. They had no way to fight it. Within 2 weeks, I received a check that covered the cost of replanting and restoration. It wasn't just about the money, it was about making them take responsibility for what they had done. The day the check arrived, I walked down to the lake with a sense of victory humming in my chest. The water had settled back to normal levels, and the dam was running smoothly again. I adjusted the gates one last time, ensuring everything was balanced. Watching the flow of water, I felt like I'd not only protected my land, but also my pride. Karen, on the other hand, had taken a serious hit. Word spread fast around the neighborhood about the meeting and the payout she'd been forced to make. A few folks who'd been intimidated by her before started standing up to her. The next time I passed by the community mailbox, one of the older neighbors clapped me on the shoulder. "You gave her exactly what she needed," he said with a grin. "Someone to show her she's not queen of the world." I just smiled. Sometimes you have to let the floodwaters teach the lesson. With the settlement money, I hired a local crew to replant the shoreline. We brought in a mix of oak saplings and willows, strong trees that would grow fast and provide shade for years to come. Watching them sink the roots into the fresh soil felt like a healing process. Those trees would take time to grow, but I had time, and they'd stand as a living reminder that no HOA bully could take away what I'd built. A few evenings later, I sat on my porch with a glass of sweet tea, looking across the lake. The sun was setting, painting the water in warm gold and pink hues. Karen's backyard, once the jewel she flaunted, still looked a mess. Muddy patches where her precious tulips used to bloom, and the stone walkway was cracked and uneven from the flooding. She hadn't been outside much since the meeting. Maybe it was embarrassment, or maybe she'd finally realized there are some battles you just can't win. I'll admit, there was a part of me that wanted to rub it in. But I'm not that kind of man, say. My victory wasn't about humiliating her, it was about standing my ground and proving that respect is a two-way street. I leaned back in my rocking chair, feeling the cool evening breeze, and let out a long, satisfied sigh. The lake was calm again. My home felt like mine again. And that, more than anything, was the real win. Before heading inside, I took one last walk down to the dock. The new trees were already standing tall in their fresh soil, and I could hear the faint sound of frogs along the shoreline. I rested my hand on one of the saplings and thought of my wife. "We did it, darling," I murmured. "We kept this place safe. The HOA hasn't bothered me since." In fact, at the next board election, Karen lost her spot as president. I wasn't surprised. People had finally seen through her bossy act. The community started working together again, like it used to be, with a little more understanding and a lot less drama. If there's one thing this whole ordeal taught me, it's this: don't underestimate a quiet man with deep roots. You can bulldoze his trees, but you can't bulldoze his resolve. Karen learned that the hard way, and as far as I'm concerned, justice was served. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized this wasn't just about trees or a flooded garden. It was about respect for the land, for hard work, and for the simple life I've built by this lake. Karen thought she could bulldoze through my property and my pride, but what she didn't understand is that this place holds my history, my memories, and my heart. Every tree I planted carried a story, and every inch of this land reminded me of my late wife's laughter on quiet summer evenings. Watching the water rise and reclaim Karen's garden wasn't about revenge, it was about balance. It was about showing her that no one is above nature or the truth. In the end, I didn't just win a fight with the HOA, I reclaimed my peace. Now, when I sit on my porch at sunset, I see new saplings standing where the old trees once were. They're small, but they're growing strong just like me. And every time I look at them, I'm reminded that sometimes justice doesn't come with shouting or fists. It comes with patience, strength, and the quiet certainty that right will always stand.